It's a good day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millzy, back with Hometown Commander. We are back for another episode of Millzy Brews, the show where I brew a deck for you on my quest to out-brew your favorite Magic channel. This is a show where I put forward to you my first draft of the deck for the commander in front of us. Hope to chat with you down in the comments about what makes this deck great, what we can change, and what we can make better about the list and the strategy in front of us. This deck originally was supposed to be, this video was originally supposed to come out last week, but if anyone didn't see my community post, man, it is late because my wife and I just had our first child, our first baby girl, and life has been a mess over the last week, but it's been a ton of fun to learn to just see my life change in a lot of ways and to figure things out. So hopefully the videos won't be too far off pace over the next coming weeks as we figure things out on the back end. It hasn't stopped me from wanting to brew. It's just stopped me from getting in this chair and recording. So today we're doing Lord Windgrace. Like I said, this is the final Landfall deck from our Landfall kind of week last week. Windgrace is probably the one that I was the most excited to brew because this is a Landfall deck that I've always heard a lot about, but I've never actually tried for myself. So I thought it could be good. Lord Windgrace 2, black, red, green, a Planeswalker that can be your commander. Only a few of them that can be, but this one can. +2, discard a card, then draw a card. If a land was discarded, we draw an additional card. -3, return up to 2 land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Really great that it doesn't say basic, it's just any land cards. And then -11, destroy up to 6 target non-land permanents, then create 6 2/2 cat warrior creature tokens with Forest Walk. So Forest Walk meaning opponent cannot block the tokens if they control a forest. Okay, so it starts with 5 loyalty, so we'd have to plus up 3 times to get to -11. But I think Windgrace has a ton of utility that we're going to try to build around. I think the big difference between this deck and like Yurok, for example, is this deck is trying its best to take advantage of the graveyard for lands as much as possible. So we want to play some cards and some strategies that will allow us to get things back out of the graveyard, to kind of let us use the graveyard to play lands from, to utilize the graveyard for our lands in specific ways. And the card to me that I think screams using our graveyard for lands is the Gitrog monster. This is a card I've wanted to build with for a long time. I didn't necessarily want to build the Gitrog monster itself as a commander because it has a nasty reputation on its own. But I think it's the perfect linchpin for a deck like this. At the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice it unless you sacrifice a land. Well, that's okay. We're probably going to have enough of them anyway. We could play an additional land each of our turns. So that's great. Well, in a Landfall deck, you already want to stack up these effects anyway, right? Where you're playing multiple lands per turn. So whenever one or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. Whenever one or more lands are put in your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. And this is important because Windgrace's +2 would allow us to discard a land and then draw again off Gitrog. But there's other ways that this is going to go really good for us. The other commander I'd really consider for this is Soul Windgrace, right? We just got Soul Windgrace in Dominaria United as a direct callback to Lord Windgrace. This one says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you would put a land card from your graveyard onto the battlefield tapped into your control. Well, this is great, right? Because we might already be trying to discard these land cards or play them out of our graveyard. Well, now Windgrace is basically trying to get them back, and then all 3 of its abilities require us to discard a land card to do something. Well, this is great because this pays off Gitrog, this pays off other things. So you can see this graveyard thing is becoming fairly centric to what a lot of our key players are trying to do. So we either gain life, draw a card, or give it indestructible by discarding a land card and paying relative mana. Okay, so I think that more or less frames what we're trying to do: play lands from the graveyard, discard things, and do that. So let's talk about the mana base. I mean, there's nothing super sexy about the mana base. I think the big things different here are we're playing Lotus Field because that puts 2 lands into the graveyard, and then we can play them back. We're playing all 3 of the bounce lands, the Ravnica bounce lands. And the reason is because it brings a land back to our hand that we can replay. We could get value from again. I think there's a lot of great things we could do. Oh, sorry, with the bounce lands. Because they bring things back to our hands. And then if we play them from our graveyard, they come back in, bounce something back to our hand, and then we could potentially have another land to play for that. We're playing Dark Depths. I think Dark Depths is an interesting land. It paired with Thespian Stage can definitely have some fun and get you that big Marilage token, which can create a bunch of havoc. We're playing Dakmor Salvage because with Gitrog specifically, Dakmor Salvage can, in Windgrace, it can potentially really just churn you through your deck and get what you need. Has Dredge too, so whenever you would whenever you would draw a card, instead you can put exactly 2 cards from the top of your library into your graveyard. If you do return this from your graveyard to your hand, what you could do here is, if you were to pitch Dakmor Salvage to Windgrace, which instead of drawing, you could dredge the 2 and bring Dakmor Salvage back to your hand, and then with Gitrog, you can kind of take advantage of that. There's a lot of these interesting little combo-y lines that I think work out really well with Gitrog and Windgrace together. But again, the goal isn't just to find Gitrog every game. The goal is to try to make the deck sing, even without Gitrog, but just taking advantage of all this. And then we're playing the Argoth Titania, because like I said, we're playing out of the graveyard, which means I think we have a solid chance of having lands in the graveyard anyway, meaning it should be a little bit easier for Titania to flip, because we're going to have lands, and we don't mind putting lands in there anyway. So we're doing that. Enchantments. This is a deck that doesn't run a ton of enchantments and artifacts, because in all reality, we have some spells and creatures we really care about. Exploration, getting us an extra land drop on our turn. Retreat to Hagra, its second ability, each opponent losing a life and us gaining a life on each landfall triggers a way for us to help in the game over time, if we could see it. Squander Resource seems kind of fun. We sacrifice a land to add a mana that land could produce. This is kind of great when we have things like Conduit of Worlds and Crucible of Worlds and Ancient Greenwood, where we can play lands out of our graveyard. What this does is allows us to still get basically, we get the mana from tapping it, we get the mana from sacrificing it here, and then we can play it back with these guys or any of these other things that play from our graveyard. So I think Squander Resources really pushes us forward on the amount of mana we have to use. Sylvan Library, trying to get us that draw at the start of our turn, try to get us those pieces into our hand. Valakut Exploration seems really fun. Whenever we land enters the battlefield, we exile the top card, and we could play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and at the end of the turn, if there are any cards exiled with, they go to the graveyard, and then it deals that much damage each opponent. So on the big turns where we're playing a ton of lands and doing a ton of things, this is going to deal damage to our opponent. Otherwise, I like this because it just extends our hand and allows us to have more cards to play and use. And then Zendikar Royal getting us those elemental tokens. Arcane Signet, Conduit and Crucible of Worlds, the pair of cards that let us play lands from our graveyard. Of course, Conduit of Worlds will allow us to play a non-land permanent from our graveyard, but that's the only thing we can play this turn. I think these are some of the best cards in the deck. We're also playing Remnant Excavator and Ancient Greenwood for the same effect. Again, we want to be able to play those lands from our graveyard because we're going to try to push ourselves into that strategy. Sol Ring. And then Zuran Orb, sacrifice land, gain 2 life. This is helpful with the same thing as something like Squander Resources, where we could sacrifice a land. If we have Gitrog out, that's going to trigger us to draw, but then we can hopefully replay that land out of our graveyard to get more value. So you can see a lot of the basis of this deck is, again, either getting lands into the graveyard and playing them out of the graveyard, or discarding them or getting to the graveyard with an effect to replay them and gaining benefit from it. So hopefully we're kind of gaining our increment of value this way. Instance, Assassin's Trophy, Deadly Relic, for the removal, crop rotation. Stuff like crop rotation and Sylvan Scrying are really important when we have a couple lands that pair really well together. We're playing Cabal Coffer's Urborg. We're playing Yavimaya Cradle Growth because we're playing a couple Planeswalkers that care about forests. So I think crop rotation and Sylvan Scrying make a lot of sense here when we're trying to potentially get certain lands. Harrow for some ramp, Heroic Intervention for some protection, Rolling Regrowth, same thing again for some ramp, but the difference here, both of these require you to sacrifice Hero requires you to sacrifice a land. Rolling regrowth doesn't. That sacrificing a land again could trigger some of our abilities, and then a pair of tutors to find some things. Going up to the sorceries, Awaken the Woods, still probably my favorite new card in the last few months for landfall decks. This is X landfall decks. Landfall triggers on a sorcery. I think can do a lot of good. It just comes down to finding the right situation, right, deploying it at the right time, and kind of getting the right value for it. Blasphemous Act. Every deck needs a board wipe, and I think this is a fairly good one at. It's going to take out most things. Cultivate, Farseek, Into the North, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth. 3 visits are our true ramp spells. Playing our Scape Shift Splendid Direct combo. So Scape Shift, we're going to sacrifice any number of lands we want, bring that many in tapped, and then Splendid Direct says return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So you would sacrifice as many lands as you want with Scape Shift, and then on the same turn or a subsequent turn, you would bring all your lands back from your graveyard. So that's pretty cool. Finality Devastation going to help us end the game because eventually we're going to have a ton of mana and want to help end the game. Tournament of Hellfire, same thing. I mean, we need these. We're probably going to have enough mana on some of these turns that we need these things to help us end the game. And Tournament of Hellfire does a great job forcing our opponents to lose 3 life or sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. And if you can get this to exit or 10 or above, man, you're going to hurt some people in the process. And Life of the Loam's kind of interesting. Return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand, and you can dredge 3 instead of drawing a card to put this back in our hand. Just like Dakmor Salvage, Life from the Loam helps us kind of fill our graveyard for these lands, but it also is just going to feed our strategy of trying to keep lands in our graveyard, trying to get lands back in our hand if we can't play them from the graveyard. I think Life from the Loam pairs really well with what we're trying to do anyway, and there are, of course, some Get Rog combos that work pretty well with Life from the Loam. Okay, heading up into the creatures. A lot of this is going to look like the who's who of most landfall decks. I just think there's a couple different choices we get to play in Windgrace than we get to play in other landfall decks. The first being Elvish Reclaimer. I know that other people, other decks can play Elvish Reclaimer, but I think the difference here is it says 2 tap, sacrifice a land, search your library for a land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. I think the difference here is we're playing so much with that graveyard that the tapping it and sacrificing the land is what we want to do anyway, because then we can play that land back out of the graveyard. Morag, one of our finishers. Every time a land comes in, we get an additional combat. This is going to help us in the game because we have a couple creatures that are going to get bigger or don't do half bad in combat anyway, right? Ashayas and Greensleeves both get pretty big depending on the number of lands we have. Omnath's a 5/5, Soul Windgrace is a 5/4, Get Rog's a 6/6. So Nixless, who we'll talk about next, gets pretty big. So we have some of these creatures who are going to get pretty big, and I think Morag's just going to help us finish the game that way. Nixless the Fallen, one of my favorite landfall triggers in the deck, and it's in black, is landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have a target player lose 3 life. If you do, put 3+1/+1 counters on Nixless the Fallen. This is great because the more landfall triggers, the more life our opponents lose. This gets around damage, preventing damage because it's losing life and not dealing damage. I think there's a lot of great things about Obnixilus, and it just does a good job at kind of pushing through. Hopefully getting a couple landfall triggers on the stack and hurting our opponents, even if it can't attack in for that. A card I've been trying more often in these landfall lists because I've noticed it does fairly well is the Living Twister. The big one is the green. Pay a green, return a tap land you control to its owner's hand. This is great in a deck where you're going to have 3 or 4 land drops for a turn, so you can return things back to your hand, play it again, get those landfall triggers, and kind of have it potentially come in untapped. Or, play another bounce and get a land back to your hand. And, we can take advantage of different things, I think, with Living Twister to get rid value. And then Titania, another one of these cards. Whenever it enters battlefield, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then whenever a land you control is put in the graveyard from the battlefield, create a 5/3 elemental. So for sacrificing lands, we can get some tokens right off of this Titania. 3 walkers in the deck. The new Nissa. I think a lot of the reason why Crop Rotation and Sylvan Scrying are so good in this deck is probably for Yavimaya for things like this. And that -7 can end a game because we're going to have lots of lands and some half-decent creatures to buff up with this. Nissa Vital Force. The +1 untaps land makes it a 5/5, which isn't bad if we're on one of these turns where we need to do a little stomping. -3 puts a permanent from our graveyard back into our hand. This is great if we're doing any of these little self-mill things to get things into the graveyard. And then -6 says whenever land enters battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So I think it's mainly for the +1 and the -3. Bringing things back, making lands into creatures, but I think ultimately it's just a little piece that helps out. And then running 7 fits this graveyard plan a lot because it's going to put things into our graveyard. Now, it gets us the lands back, but I think the interesting part about running 7 in this deck is the 0 does actually become fairly helpful. And it says putting a number of land cards from your hand on the battlefield tap. This can get us a bunch of triggers. The -3 makes us, of course, big tokens that are going to attack our opponents and help us out that way. So, yeah, I'm genuinely excited to try this deck out a little bit more eventually. I think it could be a pretty fun deck. I like the idea of this kind of graveyard-based landfall where you can take advantage of the graveyard a little bit. I'm not sure yet. Like I said, this is my first shot at this deck, so there could be a lot of things that need to change. I think there's a lot of things you learn by testing a deck, and that's the big point in Millzy Brews, is that this is a show where I'm making decks where I'm not testing them. I'm not actively sitting down and running them through the paces and figuring out how they work completely. That's something I hope that we can do together, talk down in the comments and that kind of thing about figuring out what makes these decks tick. But if you have a Windgrace deck and I've missed anything, I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments. Shoot me a comment down below. Like if you like this content, and subscribe if you want to join me on my quest to outbrew your favorite Magic channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.